This is purely a personal predilection of my own, but I really believe that humans are by nature mystics. Not necessarily occultists, not necessarily theosophists, not necessarily Gnostics even, I'm sorry to say, but they are naturally mystics. They have the capacity for individual personal experience of transcendental, of ultimate things. But just because they have that capacity and because they occasionally even run into such experience incidentally, doesn't mean they know how to utilize them. And therefore the mystery systems and the systems of the Gnostics, of the Neoplatonists, of the Hermeticists, address themselves not only to the inducing, the facilitating, the stimulating of such experiences, but their utilization. They felt that such experience needs to be first contained, secondly amplified, and thirdly assimilated. Now what does this mean? These are our words. An experience needs to be contained so it will not dissipate. When an experience is radically different from your ordinary experience to which you are accustomed, then it will dissipate. Because it's unfamiliar. You don't know how to get hold of it. You don't know how to get a hold on it, and it'll go like a dream. You don't write it down, or in some way you don't, well, there are some dreams that are so powerful that you can't forget them no matter what, you know. Even the heaviest breakfast will not chase it away, you know. But on the most part, it's such stuff as dreams are made of, to use the words of Shakespeare, very, very tenuous, gossamer, it goes away. So you have to catch it. You know what the word for soul in Greek is psyche, and it is also a name for a butterfly. The soul is like a butterfly. So you need to have a butterfly net to catch the mysteries of the soul. If you don't have a net, they are going to go away. And the people, all the people, from Jesus Christ and Buddha down to H.P. Blavatsky and all the rest of them, all they were doing was making and trying to give us such butterfly nets so that we can catch it and then we'll be able to utilize it. This is how we contain spiritual experience. And then once it hasn't been forgotten, it hasn't been allowed to dissipate, it needs to be amplified. Now, we know something about amplification nowadays because it has become a common technique in sound reproduction. It's often to our great distress. You know, my little place in the Gnostic church where I speak every Friday nights and conduct religious services on Sundays and on Wednesday nights, and sometimes on Thursdays. You know, I'm a busy old boy with my body that's beginning to fall apart. But you know, that's right on Hollywood Boulevard, which is a big street, and two big intersections right nearby. And I don't mind the cars so much. I don't even mind the fire engines because after all they are going somewhere to put out a fire, which is a rather useful thing to do. But what gets me are the highly amplified boom boxes, whatever you want to call them, ghetto blasters in the cars. Boom, 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 there they go. And said, oh, give me a break. Wasn't it nicer when we didn't have all this amplification? The music was there, you could hear it, but do I have to hear it? Do I have to hear your music, and yours, and yours, and yours? Well, amplification. The amplification makes, obviously, something louder. It makes it more noticeable. It increases its volume so that you can hear it better. And now, That is the next step. How do you amplify spiritual experience? Well, it's a little bit the same principle as the depth psychologists say about a dream. You find motifs, imagery, poetry, mythology, religious imagery, ritual material that relates to that experience, and you bring it into the picture. And thereby the whole thing grows and it becomes amplified. And you see it better. You appreciate it better. And then the final step is assimilation. When the experience in an amplified form now becomes an integral part of your psycho-spiritual makeup. It is now part of you. It is no longer something outside there that happened, but it now is an integral part of yourself. You'll carry it with you everywhere you go. You cannot lose it any longer. And when that happened, then you have taken full advantage of the experience. And perhaps you are ready for more. But that, as I say, that is an other issue. That is an other matter. Let me give you a little quotation here. I'll sort of quote myself about somebody else. How about that? That's a convoluted way of doing it. In any event, I sort of summarized and also quoted directly here a man whom I admire immensely, and that's Harold Bloom, who, you know, until some decades ago was sort of the leading literary critic of this country, and now then has become a religious critic as well. He's the man who really got sort of on the map by writing the Book of J, you may recall, about the Old Testament, and then wrote many other things. Here is Harold Bloom, one of the prominent present-day admirers of Gnosticism, describes the experience of gnosis, this thing that needs to be contained and amplified and assimilated, in contemporary terms in his book, Omens of Millennium, published a few years ago. He says one may be reading or writing or observing an image or natural phenomenon, or one may be gazing only inward. Music, incense, and ritual may play a significant part. Indeed, the sacramental and ceremonial predilections of the Gnostics are well known. In all instances, there occurs a significant altering of consciousness that transports the knower beyond the limitations of personal consciousness and indeed beyond the limitations of the very world we live in. Bloom aptly characterizes the principal disclosures of the experience of gnosis. And here I need to perhaps stop for a minute. Let's say this kind of liberating experience of gnosis is of a specific quality. And that quality sets it to some extent apart from some other varieties of mystical experience. Let's say, you know, we study, as far as it's available to us, the mystical experiences of, say, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, others of that sort, and we find that their experience is very similar to the experience of gnosis. But perhaps because of their theological orientation and so forth, it takes a little different thrust from the one we are talking about here, and therefore the disclosures that arise from this experience are somewhat different. Yet in every age and in every geographical matrix, there are some people who are natural-born Gnostics, and they include Hermeticists here too. Before I open it up for discussion, I'll briefly mention the difference and the similarity, and deal with that more next time, between Hermetic and Gnostic. Is there anything really closely resembling or analogous to Western Gnosticism in Buddhism? He said, of course. He said, and there are esoteric forms of Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, particularly what is often referred to as Dzogchen, that if you look deeply enough and you analyze the content of the system, it's pure Gnosticism. It is virtually indistinguishable except in some outer trappings from Western Gnosticism. And, believe it or not, there is a fairly large and well-established school in India. It is known as the religion of the Sant, S-A-N-T, of the Sants, which means a little bit like saint, but which, again, has as its essential thrust and nature purely Gnostic motives. It's something that evolved out of the esoteric aspects of the Sikhs to a large extent, but it has Hindu, it has Buddhist, it has Sufi elements within it, and it's, you know, I have given several lectures on it, and there are representatives of the Sants in various ways. They're sometimes referred to as satsangis, various things that are pure Gnosticism. And I don't think they necessarily got it from the West, but there is a particular kind of experience to which a particular mentality, or we might say almost a particular spiritual type, is attracted to. And somehow the disclosure, the essential conclusions that people come to as the result of their extraordinary experiences in this way are rather nicely summarized by Harold Bloom here, where he says, the principal disclosures of the experience of Gnosis are, number one, acquaintance with a God who is unknown to and remote from this world. Not a cosmic God, not even a maker of the cosmos, not even a creator, but the Para-Brahman that H.P. Blavatsky was talking about. Beyond all and yet utterly real, and yet it is the ultimate raison d'etre of everything here that is. Secondly, says Bloom, a recognition that one's deeper nature was no part of creation or the fall, but was and still is part of the fullness that is God. So a recognition that this ineffable greatness, as the Gnostics called it, this Para-Brahman of HPB and so on, is not just out there in some unknowable realm, but in some way, in miniature, and yet very, very powerfully is also present in us. Uncreated, unmade, without beginning and without an end. Was always here and will always continue to be. Fully aware, fully conscious, fully powerful, fully good and wise. And this incredible thing is inside of you. And it represents a link with its source, from whence it had come, and whither it aspires to return. A very, very important issue. And lastly, the third recognition that, or let me see, where is it? Oh, maybe, no, they added to this one, he also says that this is, there are only two recognitions here, that this God is more human and also more divine than any worshipped in the world. In fact, if you don't want to call it God, then you don't need to call it that. In any event, let me, since our time is moving, conclude this portion by saying that because this is important to conclude this cycle of thought, the soul or psyche, whatever we may call it, seeks to break out of an insufficiency within which it finds itself. Our ultimate selfhood, that higher self, Atman, whatever you wish to call it, that we have just mentioned, is encased in vehicles, as the Theosophists have called it, of various kinds, but they can perhaps, for the sake of brevity, be summarized on the psychic vehicle and the physical vehicle. The psychic vehicle includes such things as the emotions, emotional vehicle, the thinking vehicle, and so forth. But through these there filters a feeling of insufficiency. The insufficiency of material nature within which we live and move and have our beings, insufficiency of money and possessions, insufficiency of even of the well-being of the body, and then beyond that, emotional insufficiency, that our emotional needs are never really met with any degree of finality, intellectual insufficiency, that no matter how much we learn, no matter how much we seek, no matter how many books we read, how many classes we go to, we don't know enough, we haven't learned enough, and as the result of the realization of all of these insufficiencies, there occurs the great desire, the great longing for something that would be totally and really satisfying. Even as all of these situations that we find in the world are not satisfying. And a radical insufficiency. And here is the definition of how that insufficiency is met by this experience of gnosis. This is an old statement that comes from the early Gnostic period. What makes us free is the gnosis of who we were, of what we have become, of where we were, of wherein we have been cast or where we have fallen, of where to we are hastening or moving, of what we are being freed, of what birth really is, of what rebirth really is. So this is, let's say, the experience of gnosis and the kind of insights that arise therefrom. And in conclusion, I'll just mention that these insights, however, even though one may draw such conclusions from one or two of these statements, are never primarily of the character of intellectual concepts and beliefs, but rather they are more in the nature of, as Elaine Pagel suggested it, insights, flashes of the light glorious, as I'm slightly changing his wording, as G.R.S. Mead called them. So they come from an experiential region as the result of an unusual mode of cognition that is different in kind, not just in degree, but in kind, from the ones that we are generally familiar with. And it discloses with it a certain kind of insight which is liberating, which is transformative and which allows our consciousness to move on to a much freer and more accomplished plane of functioning than hitherto has been possible. To this kind of experience, Gnostics and Hermeticists were both devoted. And well, maybe I'll have more opportunity to mention that tomorrow. The principal difference really between these two, the principal one really having been that the Gnostics came from the Judeo-Christian spiritual matrix primarily, and their way of looking at this situation was affinitized to that, while the Hermeticists were Egyptians coming from the so-called pagan Egyptian matrix, and they took Hermes, the figure of Hermes, the Greco-Egyptian Hermes, as their hieratic figure, as the guide of the soul to gnosis. This was the principal difference. There are minor others. But the experience of gnosis as a liberating event in the life of the individual was central to both. This, I think, introduces in overall terms, I think, both spiritually and, let's say, to some degree, historically and geographically, where the Gnostic Hermetic tradition originates, and we will go on to other ramifications of this tomorrow. Meanwhile, I would like to open it up now to questions and comments on your part, and I do hope that they will be helpful to you. And I'll stop at this point. I probably should have warned you a little bit earlier, but let's see. You may even ask some questions that may have arisen in your minds last night. If you don't have any, I'll go on. Yes.
I think I've asked this question before, but I'm going to ask it again. Is there anything we can do to open ourselves to these experiences so that we can become more aware of them if and when they happen? A preparation of sorts.
Yeah. That's a good question. Next question, please. All right. No, I would say that, that many things could be said. But I really think that the best preparation is to allow ourselves to really feel and experience in depth and with all of its power the insufficiency of our present state of consciousness and of the various items in which we have placed our trust, probably not with much result. In other words, we need to recognize in depth that and that probably for most of us here is not such a difficult thing, that the physical world and its content and its satisfaction, such as they are insufficient. I think we are probably pretty much at the point where we have experienced that, but we need to fully experience it. That as the vernacular, current vernacular would have it, that's not where it's at, But then we need to move to others, to the kind of passing emotional satisfactions which excite us and which have their place, of course, also, but just kind of look at all the various emotional experiences that we had and that we are having and still see that they leave something wanting. And then probably most difficult for at least some of us, the mental, the intellectual side of the situation, which includes concept and precept and theory and information and so forth. That even the best, the most authoritative, the most reliable, the most useful intellectual information and intellectual concept still leaves something to be desired. Now, most of you probably believe that, maybe I shouldn't even say belief, we got to do like Elaine Pagan's beyond belief, you know. But let's say most of you probably hold that the beliefs that you formulated as the result of Theosophy were superior to the beliefs that you have held prior to that from, I don't know, the Baptist religion or a secular attitude or so forth. Yes, of course it is. But even there is something wanting. Not because there's anything wrong with Theosophy, but because there is something wrong with me. I need to be able to experience with my consciousness something more profound than any kind of conceptual framework. I need to be able to have insight. I need to be able to have gnosis. And if we go through this, you know, very seriously in various ways, then we prepare ourselves, I think, to the best advantage for the experience. Because our main problem is that we expect certain sources to deliver to us what they are incapable of delivering. There's nothing wrong with them. But something that we need at this point, they cannot give us. And when that truly sinks in, then we are ready to step into the condition, into the place that can give us what we need. So I think that's the greatest preparatory exercise and work. And it is a difficult one, very, very difficult. Yet it can be done. It has been done by a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Yes, great representative of Atlanta.
There goes the question. I enjoyed reading your book, and you have one of the traditional slaps by the Orthodox against the Gnostics was that every Gnostic seems to be his own developer of dogma and beliefs.
They wrote their own gospels. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And yet you've said in your book that the Orthodox Church perhaps adopted a number of the rituals and sacraments from that. And in the Gnostic Church, you've now created a sacramental pattern with certain rituals and things like that. How did you develop, given the paucity of sources that we seem to have about what the ancient Gnostics might have preached, and or what they may have done for ritual, and secondly, given the attack that they have no organized ritual, etc., because each one is at their own authority, how did you develop your approach to this, and what sources did you have for that?
Oh dear. Well, of course, I will have considerable time devoted to this, particularly by Sunday. But in a preliminary fashion, getting ahead of a little bit of our material, let me say that there is a somewhat subtle misunderstanding existing in many minds about the so-called incompatibility of the individual approach to gnosis on the one hand, and of various spiritual practices on the other. The experience of gnosis is, of course, very individual, But yet there is a certain commonality of approach, because there is a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of soul, a certain spiritual type, as I mentioned before, who functions in this particular way. And these people, although they move to it individually, will then develop approaches that actually are very similar to each other. The similarity comes not because they have adopted a rigid traditional format, but because their own spiritual inclinations begin to converge and move along certain archetypal patterns. That's one. And the other is that the paucity of sources concerning these matters is now less of a paucity. I don't know if there is such a word as paucitas, it would be great, but let's say there is less paucity now than hitherto has been the case, because particularly in the Nag Hammadi materials, there are indications of considerable length and considerable clarity given about spiritual practices. For instance, the Gospel of Philip is in major portion really a Gnostic work of sacramental theology that is organized around the ultimate mystery experience of the bridal chamber, but which has all the other sacraments present within it also. And so largely because of the accusations leveled against the Gnostic by people like Irenaeus, who's really been kind of put under the light, under the lamp by Elaine Pagels lately, people have exaggerated the fragmenting qualities of these individual approaches, because that is how Irenaeus worked. He said, well, if we go along with these things, then we can't have any kind of a unified church, we can't have common scriptures, we can't have common prayers, because everybody is for himself. And by writing things like this, he distorted really the Gnostic system and the Gnostic message. The Gnostic only said, you have to and you will experience for yourselves. But that doesn't mean you cannot engage in practices together, or that are similar to each other, or even come to similar results or disclosures at the end. So I think that the premises of this kind of a question are now increasingly shaky, and we need to develop a somewhat more inclusive approach about these things, which I will show you. I will have a little handout about the Gnostic sacraments and how they developed and things of that sort. Okay. I can't quite see from here. Is our... No, I think we still have a little time if you are thus inclined.
I have one.
Yeah, sure.
Stephan, when you were talking about the mysteries, I think pertaining to the transcendental experience, if you put aside, not counting the purification or the preparatory part, but I think you said there were 4 stages: the inducing of the experience, the containing, the amplification, and the assimilation. I have a question on the 3rd stage, that of amplification. Mm-hmm. Is that a stage that would go over many days when the mystery was over, or did that take place right during the actual ceremonies?
Well, I think that depends on the particular mystery system that you are dealing with. From what we know about the Eleusinian mysteries, for instance, I think the amplification took place over a period of time subsequent to some of the great experiences, the great breakthrough confrontations, then the priesthood would bring people amplifying material and information and so forth. But there were undoubtedly others where it was kind of all telescoped into a much more concentrated experience, so that these details vary from system to system in the mysteries, and I think it also varied from particular Gnostic group or particular Gnostic individual to the other. It's the principle that matters, that having an experience is not enough, but there has to be containment and there has to be amplification, that the more amplifying material we bring into the picture, the richer the understanding and the easier the assimilation is as the result of that.
Just a follow-up. If I understand you right, the amplification is not so much to prolong or sustain that experience, but to understand it in more depth.
The amplification is, well, let's say amplification is also used, say, in depth psychology in connection with dreams, visionary experiences, active imagination, things of that sort. And there also, let's say, the person had a significant dream. Now the analyst or the therapist will come in and he will say, well, look, this seems to have a similarity to this particular myth or this particular poem, this particular religious prayer or so forth. How do you feel about that? And then the person begins to say, in certain ways this really relates to my experience. And so as these related materials are being fed to the person, the original experience becomes intensified, becomes amplified. Oh yeah, this was just like that kind of thing. And the mind continues to work on it and thereby facilitates the assimilation. So I think that while that's a little different, still the principle is very much the same here also. It's amplificatory experience. Mm-hmm. There is someone, I think the lady was there first. The first shall be last. Give it to the president now. Okay, good.
Position has its advantages.
Oh yeah. 9/10
Okay,
ago.
this builds on what you were saying, because you were talking about containment and amplification, and it's hard for me to determine the line between the two, because the containing is a part of the amplification. Can you define that?
Yeah, well, of course, at certain points and within the experience, these categories tend to break down and overlap, and the demarcations between them become more blurred. But I think the containment might be envisioned more as ways of holding on to the experience immediately, not losing the memory. And not allowing it to slip into forgetfulness or get mixed with extraneous elements and things of that sort. So that to fix the experience, that's how it occurred. Again, making the analogy with the dream, it would be the writing down of the dream, or in some way fixing it so that in your memory, so this is what happened, because I certainly can testify to it, and a lot of others who have done dream work, that it's terribly easy to forget, and it's also terribly easy to begin to introduce elements that weren't really there. So you've got to get hold of it the way it really was, and then after that the amplification then can begin. Mm-hmm. The lady in blue over there, whom we have bypassed earlier.
Still talking about the same general thing. Mm-hmm. I hope that you would say a little bit more about one working alone, and say something more about how an individual, without feedback from others, can enhance the amplification process.
Oh yeah, well, certainly while the presence of a community and of a teacher or teachers, guides, and so forth is always a very good thing. Certainly, one also needs to how to deal with these matters alone. And really, if one keeps the principles in mind, then I think they can they can work at the individual level also. So just as I said before, you have an experience, extraordinary experience, then try to construct a framework now within which that is remembered, where you are not changing it, where you are not adding to it or losing parts of it, that it is there. And then, of course, if you should have literature, art, music, whatever there is available, that you can draw on, and that it has an affinity toward your experience for the amplification process. So that if you read poetry of that sort, mythology of that sort, and then you will begin to see the relationship of your experience to some of these materials which come out of the experiences of others who have been maybe not in the same place that you have been, but in a place very similar to it, and then you can amplify the experience yourself, and then assimilate it too. So that the process works the same if you are alone, except that perhaps in some ways it's a little more difficult because you don't have anyone there prompting you. Now come on, let's look at this way and so forth. You have to do it all yourself. But you certainly can, and many people have. But the important thing is to keep the principles of the process in mind, and to adhere to them as much as possible, because it's very easy to dance away from it. There are resistances within us that would just as soon that you get away from the message of this experience and so forth, and go be distracted by something, and that has to be resisted. One has to be purposeful and go on with this, and that takes perseverance within the process. Mm-hmm.